Katie Lund, who is an incoming PhD student at the University of British Columbia, whose research focuses on fairy tale and folklore references in the novels of British and Irish Romantic era women writers. She received her MA in English Literature in 2023 from McGill University, where she wrote her thesis on the role of clothing and fashion in Jane Austen's Persuasion. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, is that my audible here?
Hello, yes, we can see you and hear you.
Oh, shoot.
We cannot see you.
Sorry about that. Okay, everything is fine.
Yep, you are back.
All right, so just... Sorry, I'm just trying to find my slides now. Okay.
Okay, we can see your slides and we can hear you. Over to you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so in a letter draft of 1971, Tolkien declares that he has, quote, very little interest in serial literary history and no interest at all in the history or present situation of the English novel. My work is not a novel, but an heroic romance, a much older and quite different variety of literature. But despite this assertion, his insistence upon referring to Lord of the Rings as a romance betrays his link to the serial literary history of the novel. In the 18th century, writers of Gothic novels frequently referred to their works as romances to, quote, declare themselves anachronisms in both literary history and the history of belief. At the same time, the term romance was applied to the type of work that would become what we now know as the historical novel. Romance is thus intimately connected with these two related but distinct ways of re-envisioning the past and a conscious experimentation of form and genre. With this in mind, I propose to take Tolkien at his word and consider The Lord of the Rings as a romance, not in the medieval sense, but as the genre of literature tracing back to the artistic and political goals of 18th century Romantic prose writers. Understanding this context allows us to rethink Lord of the Rings' position in the history of the English novel. So today I will explore the ideological parallels between Tolkien and Gothic writers, and by so doing, shed light on Tolkien's complex relationship with the novel. I will also examine the echoes of the Romantic historical romance in The Lord of the Rings, focusing on the narrative framing device of the Red Book of Westmarch. Ultimately, my paper seeks to investigate how the historical turn of Romantic prose fiction may be brought to bear on Tolkien's imaginative repositioning of the novel and his complex portrayal of his own mythical history. All right, so when Tolkien asserts that The Lord of the Rings ought to be considered a romance rather than a novel, he is of course referring to the medieval genre of romance. He seeks to leapfrog right across the intervening centuries of literary development, link himself with a much older genre than the novel. However, writers have been using the same strategy for many of the same reasons as Tolkien for as long as the novel had been in existence in the English language. The father of the Gothic novel, Horace Walpole, artistically and philosophically allied himself with an antiquarian movement in the mid-18th century that sought to rehabilitate, among other things, quote, the witchery and fairy lore of Shakespeare and the obscure medieval narratives that had nourished Edmund Spenser and Shakespeare with accounts of magic and marvel, end quote, all of which had been in short supply in Restoration and Enlightenment literature. As Deidre Lynch puts it, the proponents of this movement, quote, pieced together an oppositional literary aesthetic, one that flouted orthodox visions of cultural progress and one that they promoted as a sublime, if uncouth, alternative to the languid literature of modernity, end quote. Modern literature was not all that Gothic writers rejected, though. Like Romanticism itself, says Maggie Kilgore, the Gothic is, quote, a revolt against a mechanistic or atomistic view of the world and relations in favor of recovering an earlier organic model, end quote. In other words, writers of Gothic romances created a vision of a medieval body politic whose members were bound by their connection to family and community, as opposed to the burgeoning individualism of late 18th century bourgeois society. So it's not my goal today to compare the content and structure of Lord of the Rings to Gothic writing, because that's a whole other thing, but to compare similarities between the artistic aims of Gothic writers to Tolkien's own, and also how the kinds of works that they sought to create or rehabilitate were received. So Tolkien, like the Gothic writers, was interested in a kind of literature outside of what was considered elite or highbrow. In both cases, this was essentially the realist novel. That's the highbrow, not the thing we were interested in. As Lynch points out, the Gothic had, quote, a reputation among critics and canonical romantic authors for silliness and social irresponsibility, end quote. Critics were alarmed by the escapist quality of Gothic literature. There we go. Feeling threatened by the idea that, quote, the Gothic represented simply a fairy tale world created by an imagination, which offered, quote, a tempting alternative to the mundaneness of everyday life. This feels remarkably similar to Tolkien's description of attitudes towards fairy tales in his seminal essay on fairy stories. There, Tolkien points out that many consider fairy tales as, quote, an outrageous form of escapist literature, and that escape itself is, quote, one of the main functions of fairy stories. Echoing the Gothic's rejection of much of the 18th century's political, philosophical, and industrial developments, as well as the connection between romance and the historical novel, he adds that even leaving aside the idea of fantasy, quote, I do not think that the reader or the maker of fairy stories need even be ashamed of the escape of archaism. For it is, after all, possible for a rational man, after reflection, quite unconnected with fairy story or romance, to arrive at the condemnation, implicit at least in the mere silence of escapist literature, of progressive things like factories or the machine guns and bombs that appear to be their most natural and inevitable, dare we say, inexorable products, end quote. Without intending to draw any direct comparisons between the specific politics of the Gothic and Tolkien's own views, Tolkien and writers of the Gothic share this antipathy towards aspects of modernity, and this antipathy is signaled in no small way by their preferred designation of romance. Okay, so as I've said, the use of the term romance in the place of novel in the late 18th or early 19th centuries was not, limited to the Gothic, but was also used for the developing genre that would become the historical novel. So while the Gothic genre is interested in a specific vision of history, like its visions of melodramatic hauntings and bloodshed and air of titillating mystery and suspense and its habit of playing fast and loose with historical fact, separated it from the content and tone of Romantic era historical romances. Writers of these romances frequently deployed strategies found in history writing in an attempt to be taken seriously in a way that the Gothic was certainly not. Yet it remained romance, a term that represented for writers of historical fiction, as it did for writers of the Gothic, a, quote, liberation of fictional impulse, end quote, beyond the realist novel. Ina Ferris refers to the historical romance as, quote, a mixed genre, noting that romance, quote, now denoted not only the realm of fancy, as in the case of the Gothic, but a superseded literary form of renewed interest in the rethinking of the national past, end quote. By the end of the 18th century, the association between romance and historical rather than Gothic fiction was firmly established. In a 1797 essay, the philosopher William Godwin, also known for being the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft and father of Mary Shelley, argues that, quote, the writer of romance is then to be considered as the writer of real history, end quote, because, unlike authors of traditional history writing of the time, they can incorporate the passions and novelistic emotional development in their narratives. All right, so to return to Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a history of sorts. It is an account of the War of the Ring as told by the Hobbits, but can we read it as a historical novel, a historical romance? And if we do, what can it tell us about Tolkien's relationship to this key period in the development of the English novel? So to answer this question, I want to examine some of the ways in which Tolkien's narrative choices in his representation of the cultural history of Middle-earth echo the strategies employed by 18th century writers of romance. Finally, I will touch on the influence of the king of the romantic historical novel himself, Sir Walter Scott. Sharon Schroeder has explored some of the possible sources of Scott's influence on Tolkien, including Tolkien's understanding of fairy, his conception of Middle-earth, and his approaches to narrative poetry. But there is more work to be done researching the effect of Scott's prose fiction on Tolkien, who, according to a 1968 quote, as Schroeder discusses, indicated that Scott's body of work was, quote, literature that the general reader should know. All right, so one of the primary parallels between Lord of the Rings and Gothic and historical romances is his usage of the found manuscript conceit, in which an author pretends to be the editor or translator of a real-world text. Manuscript discovery narratives are frequent in 18th century fiction. That was a quote. And the metatextual narrative of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, a key ancestor of both the Gothic and the historical romance, is a prime example. As Richard Maxwell notes, quote, the book itself has a history. In the appendices to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien claims to have translated and drawn from the so-called Red Book of Westmarch, referring to the manuscript written by Bilbo, Frodo, and finally Sam after the events of the novel. Scholars have connected Tolkien's usage of this conceit to 18th century epistolary fiction, so like the works of Samuel Richardson, and also the manuscript tradition, the forged or otherwise, of 18th century antiquarian works. So today I want to read the concept of the Red Book as a narrative conceit and as a book in its own right, alongside the development of the Romantic era historical romance. So we're first introduced to the Red Book in the prologue to Lord of the Rings, but it's only in the final chapter that it appears in the text proper. So we read, "There was a big book with plain red leather covers. Its tall pages were now almost filled. At the beginning, there were many leaves covered with Bilbo's thin, wandering hand, but most of it was covered in Frodo's firm, flowing script. It was divided into chapters, but chapter 80 was unfinished, and after that were some blank leaves. The title page had many titles on it, crossed out one after another. So, My Diary, My Unexpected Journey, There and Back Again, and What Happened After. Adventures of Five Hobbits, The Tale of the Great Ring, compiled by Bilbo Baggins from his own observations and the accounts of his friends. What We Did in the War of the Ring." And then we have Frodo's titles. We have The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King, as seen by the little people, being the memoirs of Bilbo and Frodo of the Shire, supplemented by the accounts of their friends and the learning of the wise, together with extracts from books of lore translated by Bilbo in Rivendell. So right away, we have several layers to the history of this book. It has multiple authors, and it's gone through numerous different titles. But what's fascinating to me is how its progression echoes some of the changes taking place in historical fiction between the mid-18th century and the opening decades of 19th. So let's begin with Bilbo's titles. They begin with the personal, the intimate. We have My Diary, My Unexpected Journey, before coming a little more sensationalist, like the titles of adventure stories. Finally, they become a little more academic, but still emphasizing the personal viewpoint and ending by announcing what we did in the War of the Ring. So what does this have to do with the romantic historical novel? So as I've said, the historical novel was related to and developed alongside the Gothic romance, but they are not the only members of this family tree. So between the middle of the 18th century and the publication of Walter Scott's Waverley in 1814, there was a smattering of literary genres, each with their own vision of the past, that contributed to what ultimately became the historical novel. These included the antiquarian romance, which portrayed vignettes of daily life and was derided for being extremely bogged down in historical description. There was a national tale, which is a genre mostly focused in Ireland and Scotland and dealt in matters of national history and identity. And there was the secret history. The secret history was a genre of fiction that appeared in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, consisting of often salacious works professing themselves to be the inside story, the behind the scenes, up close and personal account of a real historical event or figure. They had a loose relationship with historical fact and frequently used manuscript conceits. The key point about the secret history that I want to stress here is that it was a narrative that, quote, stood at a distance from official history and represented, quote, a locus where the past could be contested and rewritten, either by pointing to what had been overlooked or hidden, or by speculating on what might have been, end quote. In Bilbo's own portion of the Red Book, the part recounting the narrative of The Hobbit, it is frequently mentioned how Bilbo's role in the quest of Erebor is undervalued or simply goes unnoticed by the greater figures around him. That when the tales of the great events are told in later years, some of his crucial actions are completely absent. For this reason, Bilbo's creation of this personal, insider, untold history, complete with dramatic, adventurous titles, links him to the 18th century secret history. So now for Frodo's titles, these guys here, and his ultimate completion of the text. So while Bilbo's titles are printed in italics, they look kind of, or even the way that the text prints them, they look a little like handwritten, a little casual. Frodo's are in very official looking small caps, and his subtitles are in ordinary text. The titles are concise and academic. There is no use of the first person, singular or plural. Frodo centers the historical events and places the Hobbit's viewpoint in the subtitles before stressing the inclusion of external academic sources. Frodo's choices reflect changes that had occurred in historical fiction by the early 19th century, when authors sought to increase the respectability of their work with increased inclusion of historical fact rather than fantastical speculation. In 1814, Sir Walter Scott published Waverley, the first of several historical novels. So Scott's novels, quote, synthesized antiquarian romance with realist fiction and historical theory with national romance to initiate a new phase not just in the history of historical fiction, but in that of novel writing. So there we are. This new species of fiction, growing out of 18th century romances, incorporated, quote, various linguistic forms of popular memory, song, tale, anecdote, and the languages of the cultural margins which had been renounced from legitimate history. End quote. If the Red Book of Westmarch is the historiographical text that forms the basis, but not the exact text for Lord of the Rings, then Lord of the Rings, translated, edited, and embellished by Tolkien, according to the conceit, is like the historical novel as developed by Scott, drawing from history and the tradition of realist prose fiction, while including intertextual material, including poems and songs. Now, I'm not arguing that Tolkien was consciously reading or reworking literary developments of the late 18th century, nor that he even had Scott on the brain while writing this. But in his depiction of the transition between Bilbo's and Frodo's approaches to historiography, if you will, Tolkien is exploring some of the very same aspects that real-world historical writing was undergoing in the early 19th century. This piece of history writing, embedded within a novel, itself displays novelistic features, just as actual history writing began to do in the wake of Scott's Waverley novels. So I'll finish where I began, with Tolkien's rather ambivalent relationship with the novel. He would doubtless be horrified by the idea of having his works and artistic ideology compared to the sensationalist Gothic romance or secret history of the 18th century. He may have scoffed at efforts to understand the influence that Scott's writing had on him. But it would be a disservice to Tolkien's scholarship to merely think of the romance in the medieval sense when discussing both his literary views and his works, and to take him at his word when he denies his status as a novelist. So reading The Lord of the Rings with the context of the 18th century romance revival and the historical novel tradition that it spawned enriches our understanding of Tolkien's place in literary history and the tools that he used to create and portray his own history. We're excited there.
Hello? What do you want? As if right at the last minute, the microphone decides to die. Anyway, let's move on. Katie, thank you so much for that fascinating paper and for rounding off our seminar. So let's open the floor to some questions. Does anyone have a question for Katie about her paper? I shall move online. Okay. So Katie, there's a question here, and considering your work with novels as well, I think actually it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts on this. So would having your work considered a novel somehow have been an insult to the work versus the label romantic?
Are we thinking, like, would it be an insult to Tolkien or insult to the people in the 18th century? Because they both were like avoiding that term, but
Let's nuance it and say both.
Okay. So the history of the novel is it's really complicated. In its beginnings as a genre, it was seen as very lowbrow, especially when you had a lot of women writers at the early history of the novel, like Eliza Haywood, writing very sort of sensational sort of romance novels, and that was the beginning of the genre in many ways. And it took a long time for it to really attain the sort of cultural prestige that it eventually did. And so it was tricky, and it was associated in many ways for a long time with women writers, and there's a very complex history of the usage of the term novel. By the late 18th century, that was a little bit less of an issue, but it was still kind of I would say on the margins still of cultural prestige. And Walter Scott, the way he kind of transformed historical fiction from these different kinds of genres that were kind of ridiculed, and some of them were a little bit silly, and some of them were a little bit boring. And he's saying, no, we're going to make this a serious literary genre, and it just exploded in popularity because he was Walter Scott, and everything he did turned to gold. Except for nowadays when no one reads him. But so that it was complicated, and the Victorians really like ran with the novel in many ways. For Tolkien, there's some interesting quotes in his letters that I found when I was researching this, where he's associating kind of the history of the novel with women writers. Like, women haven't really had their voice in literary history until the advent of the novel. But then he also like derides the novel. I'm like, should I put these two things together? I don't know. But he's not interested in being part of that. I don't think he thinks much of 18th century literature. I'm not even sure what he thought of Victorian literature. I wish I knew more, but he just wants to separate himself. He wants to really be connected with other forms of literature. So I might have lost the track of the original question, but I don't know if he would have. I don't know if he was necessarily saying that novel is a bad thing, novel is an insult. I think he's just saying novel's fine, but it's not what I'm doing, even though it was what he was doing. So that kind of, it's a very interesting question to think about, but I think there's a lot of layers to consider here.
Certainly. Part of the reason why I thought maybe expanding that to consider both areas would be useful. Okay, so we have another one here. So how does the world of nature fit into this historical romance heroism?
The world of nature. That's not something I considered very much. I think it's really interesting. I was considering more about language and narrative framework. I think it'll be really interesting to consider how Gothic novelists and historical novelists were treating the natural world in this period, and whether or not it was distinct in any way from how maybe more realist fiction writers were treating the natural world. So it's not something that I think I can speak to off the cuff, but I think it'll be really, really interesting to look into for sure.
Yeah,
So that's a great question.
I suppose as well with the recent rise of eco-Gothic as a interdisciplinary field that could really potentially yield some interesting readings and comparisons between the two. I know that there's a couple of scholars who have started to look at eco-Gothic criticism specifically with Tolkien. So yeah. Okay, time for one more question in the room. You are literally asking the last question of the seminar. Make it a good, no pressure.
From the first person. Hi, Katie. I wondered about the notion of epistolary, and I know that in the 18th century, we would kind of move from epistolary novels from Afrabein on, and then we shift to inserting or folding letters into a more omniscient. So something like Eleanor and Marianne was epistolary, and then Sense and Sensibility is not, but contains letters. And I wondered if there's any parallel, like you did so beautifully with the titles of the Red Book, if you could make any comparisons with Lord of the Rings and letters.
Lord of the Rings and epistolary. That's an interesting concept, because the only place we really see a consistent usage of like posts or mail system is in the Shire. So yeah, they now have a sort of an epistolary culture there. But gosh,
there's Gandalf's letter, right? That
yeah,
Parliament forgets and forgets and forgets. And then it's actually in the text.
I think that comes to mind for me is that like someone like Jane Austen, while her juvenilia there's a lot of epistolary fiction there because that was what was still popular in the 1780s and 90s when she was young. She then, in her more mature works, uses letters as like intertextual narrative tools. So there's, there's letters in Pride and Prejudice. There's a number, I can't think of the number off the top of my head. And so sometimes you have a letter that's mentioned, but sometimes you actually print it out in the text. So you have that layering effect. And I'm thinking in Tolkien, we often have a similar effect with characters telling each other extended stories. So like in the Council of Elrond, we have, layer and layer and layer of stories. So I think maybe it's not literally epistolary, but I think that you could probably draw some parallels between the later sort of careful use of epistolary elements in sort of early 19th century literature with how Tolkien uses like within like he uses narratives within the narrative, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, beautifully answered. Thank you.
It's a great question. I love thinking about epistolary fiction.
Love a bit of epistolary fiction. Yeah, Christian was just saying, actually, Cami opened the seminar. So there we go, full circle. Can we give Katie one final round of applause?